So how many stools will fit at your kitchen counter? Hi everyone, it's Carol from Discover Interior Design and I'm so glad you're here. Well, in this video we are talking about space planning and how to figure out how many stools will fit at either your kitchen island or at your kitchen counter. And also we'll talk about some ways to save space, to kind of maximize space, especially if you have limited space near your counter. So let's get started. So when we are trying to figure out how many stools will fit at a kitchen counter or at our kitchen island, one thing that we are trying to do is have it be as functional as possible. So that means trying to figure out how many stools will fit in that area so that it's easy to get in and out of the stools, and also that those stools aren't going to be in the way of any pathways. And there are many different approaches you can take to try to figure this out, to try to figure out how many stools will fit in a specific area. But one approach is just to start with the stool that you are interested in buying for your kitchen, and then working from there to figure out how many you should buy. So the first thing that you want to find out is what is the width of the stool? What is the widest part of that stool? And pay attention to this part because the widest part may be the seat, or maybe the stool is the same width from the seat all the way down to the bottom. But one thing that may happen is maybe where the legs are and the foot of the stool is, that may be the widest part. So what I want you to do is pay attention to that and find the widest part on the stool. So these stools are a good example of this, where the seat has a certain width, but the widest part is all the way at the foot of those stools. And part of the reason for that is that it creates more stability when all of those legs are at an angle. It helps to provide a functional and stable place to sit. So just take some time to figure out where is the widest part of the stool. And then the next thing that we need to do is to figure out how much space a stool needs. And what we always want to think about with any piece of furniture is that, yes, there is the actual size of that piece of furniture, but every piece of furniture that we have in our home needs to have some space around it so that it is functional. So with a stool, we want to make sure that there's plenty of space on either side of the stool or in between each stool. So there's plenty of room for people to sit there comfortably, as well as being able to get in and out of those stools easily. So one thing that you can try is just to add on 6 inches to the width of the stool. So for example, if we have a stool that is 17 inches wide, that's the widest part of that stool, I would just add on 6 inches. So the overall space that we need for that stool is going to be 23 inches. So ideally, it's nice to have around 6 inches in between each stool. And this will depend on the stool. If you have a larger stool, or maybe even something that's a little smaller, you may be able to adjust that a little bit. But ideally, it's kind of nice to have 6 inches in between each stool. So if we add on 6 inches to each stool, that will leave 3 inches on either side. So after you have the overall space that you need for a specific stool, then I want you to look at your counter area, whether that's at a countertop or whether that's at a separate kitchen island. And what we want to do is figure out how much usable space that we have to work with. And you want to pay attention to the design of that area. So what I mean by that is that you want to make sure that you're measuring the area underneath the counter, because sometimes a counter may overhang a little bit. And so you wouldn't want necessarily to measure the width of that counter, because actually the space underneath the counter where you're going to be sitting is actually not as wide. So what I want you to pay attention to is to measure those areas underneath the counter where there's space for the stools. So for instance, in this example, this kitchen island actually has a countertop, and the island part, that is even. The countertop is not overhanging the sides of the kitchen island area. So we actually could measure just from the top of the countertop from side to side to figure out how much space we need, because it will be the same. So when we have that measurement, as in this example, we have a measurement of 60 inches wide of an area that we can use for the stools. Then we need to think about setting aside some space on either side, because we don't want to place the stools right up to the edge. We want to have those stools inside that whole entire area, because we want to make sure that it's easy to get in and out of those stools, as well as we don't want the stools to be blocking any sort of pathways or areas where maybe people are standing at the counter. So you can start with setting aside 3 inches on either side. So what that would mean would be subtracting a total of 6 inches from your overall width of that counter area. So in our example, that would mean that we have actually 54 inches to play with, to work with, for figuring out how many stools will fit in that area. So now all you have to do is take the overall usable width that you have for the countertop, divide that by the width of the stool, and then that will tell you how many stools will fit there. So after we do those calculations with our measurements that we took for this island, then it came out that we can have space for 2 stools. So what happens if you don't have a stool in mind, so you don't have exact measurements of a width that you need to set aside in that area? Well, I would just start with 30 inches. So just plan on 30 inches per stool, and that will kind of give you a good estimate of how many stools will fit in that area. And then when you shop for stools, you may find a stool that is smaller, or maybe around that size, or maybe a tiny bit bigger. But using 30 inches is a good place to start, just so that you have plenty of space in between the stools and around the stools. And here are some rooms that are good examples of where there's just the right amount of stools in that kitchen counter or kitchen island area. We can see that there's plenty of space in between each of those stools, as well as space on the sides of the stools. And then another thing to keep in mind is that there are different heights of countertops in our kitchen. In general, all of the countertops in our kitchen are around 36 inches high, and we just call that counter height. But if we have an area that has a higher level to it, as in this example, that would be probably called a bar height. And so when you're shopping for stools, you want to make sure that you are buying the stool that will go with the height of your counter. When you're out and about looking online or in person, sometimes stools are called bar stools or counter height stools, but sometimes a bar stool is actually maybe a counter height stool. So pay attention to the measurements when you are shopping for a stool. Because for a counter height stool, you'll want to look for a seat height that is between 24 to 27 inches high. But if you have an area, as in this example, where you have a little higher area that's at a bar height, then you want to look for a seat height that is between 28 to 30 inches high. And what we're looking for is that there's around 10 inches between the bottom of the counter to the top of that seat. And then if you are limited on space, there are a couple things that you can look for when you're looking for a bar stool. One thing is to not choose a bar stool that has a back. So that saves up space just because of that design doesn't have a back to it. The other thing that you can look at is a design that doesn't have any arms on it, because if that bar stool has arms to it, that probably takes up more space and makes that bar stool wider. So when you don't have a back or arms on the stool, then that is easier to tuck under the counter, whether that's completely or most of the way, so that it helps to save space and it's easy to walk around that area, especially when no one is sitting in those stools. And look for a kitchen stool that is around 17 inches wide, especially if you really are limited in how much space that you have. And please let me know if you have any questions about this topic, and also share your experience and your design ideas on how you figured out how many kitchen stools will fit in your kitchen. And if you want to find out more about space planning and other ways to make your space very functional, you can check out my space planning playlist, and I'll leave the link to that playlist in this video's description. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.